Hello, we're going to spend about 40 minutes talking about the production module, which is a module, an add-on module for Spire that handles manufacturing and will allow you to build items up via production orders as part of a process that integrates really nicely with inventory, purchase order processing, requisitions, shows you costs of items as you're going along, as well as allows you to handle multi-step and multi-stage builds. My name is Rick Notman. I'm the QA lead at Spire Systems. That's about as much as I need to say there. Production software. A little bit of my experience here. I was really excited about doing this session because I've had some experience with working with manufacturing software. And it's interesting because unlike MRP software or accounting software, it really runs the gamut from potentially entry-level packages, although they're quite unusual, right up to $250,000, $500,000, multi-million-dollar packages. So there's a real range of the expectations of production software, and I think Spire really exceeds a lot of those expectations, especially given what it costs. So I'll spend a fair bit of time talking about that. As I mentioned, it's quite a range of price and functionality. There's many options. Most of them for existing accounting systems are add-ons. So there are some fairly expensive add-ons available for all kinds of different packages, whether that be Spire or Sage products of other kinds. There are add-ons that are specific to manufacturing. Their add-ons can be very powerful. The one big downside to add-ons, though, is the integration sometimes means you lose that ability to quickly jump between, how much of this item do I have? Is there a purchase order outstanding? Have I requisitioned this through a vendor? And that's one of the real powerful parts about how production software works in conjunction with Spire is that it's built right in, so it's very nicely integrated. And I'll show some great examples of that as we go. It's important with production software. It's important with any software, but particularly with production software, to know what it is that you're looking at. There's such a range of available options with production software that's a really good idea to install a demonstration package, model the bills of materials that you want to build, look at your process, and really understand whether or not this suits what you're looking for, particularly because the expectations are not as standard, I find, for production as they might be for example accounting, where there is one correct way to do accounting, even though there might be multiple ways to come to that conclusion. Ultimately, it's debits and credits and the appropriate accounts. With production, there are varying different levels of expectation. So I'll take you through how Spire works and explain it as we go. So obviously, a business case and trial use is really highly recommended. We can make a demo available to anybody who doesn't currently use production and even turn that particular functionality on as a trial use kind of thing. And of course, when you first install Spire and it's on a trial, production is immediately available for you to use. So we really recommend that you sort of model your processes through just to make sure that we cover off everything that you might expect in production software. It's an add-on for Spire. It costs $4,000, and then there are maintenance costs to go along with that. That is either expensive or the cheapest thing you'll ever see in terms of production modules. And from the kind of functionality I'm going to show you today and what's available relative to what I've seen in the market, it's so cheap that you almost want to try it just to see if it can save you some time. Very powerful what it can do, and at the price, it's probably underpriced. Demo installs have it installed automatically. I think I mentioned that. It extends the functionality past basic bills of materials into the existing base product, meaning that there is some degree of bill of material handling without having the production module installed, but what production brings in is things like production order processing and some additional functionality, which is really important when you're starting to actually manufacture things. Kitting and macros are sometimes useful and sometimes even sufficient. I'll show you a quick example before we get rolling in the demo of what a kit looks like in Spire. And that, of course, doesn't require the production module. So if that's sufficient for you, you don't need the production module. If it's not sufficient for you, and I'd suggest that in most time-dependent processes it probably isn't, then you'll want to look at the production module. Production terminology and process. A produced build item has a recipe, which is what I refer to as a bill of material or a BOM. We internally refer to that as a template in the context of how it's used with production orders. So we'll kind of walk through that example. Bills of materials can have multiple levels. So while it's like a recipe, that recipe can be made up of multiple levels of items. So the idea here is that unlike a kit, which is usually sort of made up on the spot, put these items together in a box and assign a price, a bill of material is usually multiple processes, each of which can be independent of the whole, but contribute to the whole. In the example I've built up here, I've tried to keep it simple enough that we can get our head around it, but complex enough that you get the idea that it can be built in different stages, and material requirements can be determined based on the manufactured item as a subcomponent or the manufactured item as its whole. And if that doesn't make sense yet, hang on, we'll get there. There's usually a time-dependent process, and that's primarily the difference between a kit and a bill of material. You can actually introduce your own time dependency with kits, but there's really nothing in Spire that stops a kit from instantly being built as soon as the user attempts to use it on a sales order. But there is nothing in Spire that will automatically invoke the allocation of inventory for a manufactured item when you add it to a sales order. And that's, of course, entirely intentional. You don't want to be able to say, here's your kayak that's been built automatically the moment that you sold it on a particular sales order. And the activity of building is controlled by a production order. The idea here is that while you could actually build an item directly from the inventory item, you normally want a production order to control that process. And there's a reason for that. Normally you want that production order because it becomes a document that can then be communications can be put against it, things can be recorded to it, and it's really kind of a working document to say that, yes, I'm building this kayak rack, but it's for this particular customer, or I'm building 5 for stock, and it becomes an independent process of the template or the bill of material that drove it in the first place. And again, as we work through an example, you'll see how that works. And then, of course, sales, purchasing, inventory, and the requisition process are all part of that process, meaning that the problem with add-ons, as I mentioned earlier on, is that add-ons oftentimes will end up in a situation where there's a delay between when the production process starts and when inventory is updated. It's not instantaneous. It's not always easy to see how these things work together. So there's multiple processes that have to kind of integrate. The nice thing about using Production Manager from right within Spire is it's all automatically integrated. As soon as you commit the inventory items to start a production build, all through Spire, anybody who's looking at those inventory items or trying to sell them is going to know that this particular item is part of a bill of material and it's been committed. So those are things that make this process even more powerful, given that production is built right into the Spire system. So in our example, what are we building? We're going to build a kayak rack, basically a high-end kayak rack that lifts the kayak up. I'm doing that because it's of personal interest to me, mostly because my back is killing me after the summer. It has multiple level deluxe kayak rack. We're going to start with an on order and inventory and nothing in stock. So in order to try and keep this as clean an example as I can possibly show you, I want to kind of walk you through what it's like to get an inventory in and see its effect on availability through the bill of material itself. So of course, inventory availability is key, particularly key when you're talking about manufacturing or production or even kitting, because you want to know that while you might have enough to build any individual component, when you start to put the pieces together, you start to run out of inventory, and you want to know when you've run out of inventory, what you need to bring in. And then towards the end, I'll show you a really neat example where we actually use the requisition module to handle all that for you more or less automatically. And then, of course, production orders themselves, as I mentioned, are a document type. So they're similar in the sense that they're a document that gets assigned a number, like a sales order or purchase order, and then that number can then be referred to and is automatically updated as the stages of the production order go through. So whether that's phases, or that's committing of inventory, or that's modifying the template that's on that particular production order, the production order sort of stores that activity as being distinct from how it might have started. And then, of course, there's committing and building. And a big part, as I've said, about production processing is keeping track of inventory. Do I have enough? If I do have enough, where's it committed? Who's currently working on it? What stage is it at? Those are all the things that are important in production to keep a production floor rolling along, whether it's a small shop with job stations or whether that's something larger that's building larger items. And then, of course, the requisition cycle, which is probably the most powerful part of this whole process because of the nature of how it all integrates together and the feedback that starts right at the sales phase, goes all the way down to production and purchase order creation, and comes all the way back up again. So again, I'll show you an example towards the end. We won't have a lot of time to complete the whole thing, but I'll show you how the process works and how nicely it integrates. And then before we jump into the software, I just want to give you a bird's eye view of how this particular bill of materials is going to go, or how it looks. So we have a kayak rack, which is the actual finished good. We have other items which couldn't in and of themselves be finished goods, but are actually part of that kayak rack, and they are then made up of components. As I mentioned earlier on, a sub-assembly or an assembly can be part of another assembly, so you can have multiple layers deep. You can go quite deep on this, and I've seen some examples of bill of materials where there's many, many levels deep, but I don't want to get too involved. This is about as complex as I want to get before it gets too hard to describe. So you have a kayak rack. It's made up of 3 sub-assemblies, which is made up of components, and one of the components is another sub-assembly, which is made up of more components. And then just to get the point across that we keep track of availability of inventory, I've reused some components. So this particular sub-assembly uses bolts and nuts, as does this one, just to show you that it keeps track of the requirements across those sub-assemblies or bills of materials within a production order. So let's just hop out of here. We'll minimize that. I'm already logged into Spire. But before we get into that bill of material, just a quick sort of differentiation between what a kit looks like and what a production order looks like. I'm just going to spend a quick minute in a kit. So what's a kit? As I mentioned earlier on, you don't have to have the production manager to use kits. I have a kit in this data. It's set up as kitted as opposed to manufactured. Its tabs called kit components, and it really only has one level. You can actually maintain kits within kits, but generally speaking, kits often are built immediately on request and generally have one level. So here we can see that this is made up of these various different items. Recently, I think 3.8 or so, we introduced a roll-up cost that's calculated automatically. So you can see right here that if you build this kit at this point, it's going to cost $82.96. And of course, that number changes as current costs and roll in, and the average cost changes on the item. But using it's really straightforward. If I create, let's just sell that to somebody. Let's sell that to AutoZone. What you'll see is that automatically, if it's set up to, pops up request as to whether or not you want to swap out components. I'm going to say, no, I don't. Just select OK. I currently don't have enough components to build this, or items to build this, but this is how the kit lands out on the sales order. And kitting itself has some really nice features I won't spend a lot of time on, but one of the nicest is that if you can either show the breakdown on your printed documents that you give to your customers, or you can toggle the kit components and show it as one parent item. The big thing here being that we roll up the cost of the components that go into the kit for the cost of the overall kit, but the unit price itself is on the kit parent item. That's similar in a sense to how a produced or assembled item works. It's just that it's automatic. You'll notice there was no point at which I pulled the inventory or got ready for this. It just happens the moment that I go ahead and go into the sales order and create the kit. It automatically starts allocating inventory. So production's a little different. Let's show you a production item. So here's my kayak rack deluxe. You'll notice that that's now a manufactured item. It has a bill of material now instead of kit components. And let's make that a little bigger so we can see the whole thing. You'll notice that right now I don't have enough inventory to build this, but I just want to toggle everything open so you can see everything. So just like we saw on that diagram that I showed, we now have our kayak rack deluxe, which has made up of 3 sub-assemblies. And one of the sub-assemblies has another assembly inside that, which is made up of yet more components. So a couple things right out of the gate that you can tell immediately. One, if you see the item square, that indicates that this is an assembled item, meaning that it can actually have components. If it's circle, it means it's a subcomponent. We can also see some degree of availability automatically. So when I go to build this kayak rack deluxe, it's going to pull in all the appropriate inventory that it needs. But right now, I don't have enough of anything. There's no green here indicating that I can actually build this. So what's at this point the difference between orange and red? If I select the weld rod, for example, and choose open inventory, we know that I need 4 weld rods here plus 4 weld rods here, plus some additional weld rods. So let's open that up. And we can see right now that I theoretically am going to have enough weld rods. I just haven't received them yet, meaning that they're currently outstanding on a purchase order or sitting on an inventory adjustment. They're about to come in. So orange essentially means you may have enough when these things come in, but you don't currently have them in stock. What's the difference between orange and red? If I look at red, I can see that I've got a requirement of these bolts across here that's somewhere in the area of 30, 40 something. If I open up inventory here, I can see that while I need 40 something of these bolts, I've only got 20 that are currently on order, meaning that even after receiving these purchase orders, receiving these adjustments, I'm not going to have sufficient stock to be able to proceed forward with this build. So right there, just looking at the screen, you automatically have some really useful information about what it is that you can do and what it is that you can't do in terms of building this manufactured item. At this point, without even using the production manager, I can go ahead and attempt to build this and so on. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to save that, and I'm going to start the production process, and I'm going to do that by creating a production order. So brand new production order, that's essentially saying I want to start to build this kayak rack. And let's add that item in. You'll notice, well, actually, instead of doing it that way, let's browse first. You'll notice when you browse that you don't see all of inventory here. You only see those items that are manufactured items that can be part of the manufacturing process. I want to build the top level item, the Kayak Rack Deluxe. And as soon as I load that, you'll see that explodes out into my assemblies. So there's all my assemblies. I can expand them. So there's a couple of things this means right out of the gate. One, it's essentially set up right now to say when I want to go ahead and build this Kayak Rack Deluxe, I'm going to pull right down to the lowest levels of materials, meaning don't use sub-assemblies that are currently in stock. If there's a roller riser there, ignore it. If there's a lift assembly there, ignore it. I want to build these as part of this process. What it means when you toggle this, and I'm going to show another example of this in a second, but if I say toggle selected, what I'm now saying is I want to assume that I'm going to be using roller risers as assembled goods, as opposed to, if I toggle selected again, building the roller riser as part of this production order. And obviously that can make a big difference depending on how you're organizing your build. If the idea is that I always want to build the roller risers first, I can arrange my manufacturing process that way if I want to. I can have production orders just building roller risers separately, and then I can have those integrated as a component into this bill of material. But let's do it this way first. We'll go right down to the lowest level. I can assign customers. You're going to see that in a minute. And I can put this into a producing state if I want to. For now, though, I'm just going to save and close this. And let's go to inventory. And I've got an adjustment waiting here. Normally, this would be through a purchase order, but just for speed, I'm going to open up my adjustment. And let's post it. And we can preview that, and that just shows us that our inventory adjustment is affecting inventory with the appropriate costs and the appropriate values. So across the board here, I think I've received 20 of each of the things that I think that I'm going to need. So let's close that. We'll come back to production. We'll open up that production order, and now you'll see that I'm starting to get some greens here, which is indicating that I have enough weld rods. If I figure out across all my requirements how many weld rods I need, it's been satisfied by that receipt. Same with 2-inch lock jaws and the web tamper-proof webbing and so on. And of course, the nice thing here is because it's all integrated at any point, if I just click open inventory, I can see that on order, in this case from an adjustment, has now been made available, which is why I can satisfy this particular production order in the parts that it needs up to the point at which I've got green items. Let's do another quick adjustment. Let's just save that again. And let's do a quick adjustment. So I'm going to go into inventory adjustments. So we're clear, this is not normally how you handle inventory. I'm just kind of doing this for speed. And I'm going to receive 60 of these. And, oops. $60 of these. And I want some bearings. So 60 of these. So same thing, I'm going to post. I'll skip the reports. And let's reload the production order. And now we're all green. So now we know that we have enough inventory to satisfy all the different elements of this particular production order that we're trying to build. Let's show you one more thing. I mentioned that I'd say this a couple of times, so let's say it one more time. If I decide that I don't want to actually go right down to the materials to build all my sub-assemblies, I can collapse this at this point, and it is meaningful. Meaning if I say toggle selected, what I'm essentially saying now is I don't want to build these as part of this production order. I'm assuming that they're going to be built as part of other production orders. So effectively, even though I have the inventory to build the roller risers, I don't have roller risers built, and that's the expectation of this production order. So these toggling things, open and closed, is a visual thing versus toggling whether or not it's selected and open or closed is a meaningful thing. It actually controls the build process and controls the expectations of what's going to happen when I go ahead and try and process this bill of material. Okay, so let's create a production order. Or rather, I should say, let's actually talk a little bit about the production order that we're creating. So a couple quick things. You can have production notes at the top level of a particular production order that you're creating, but you can also have notes at any particular level. So if I say click on the lift assembly, there's instructions at the lift assembly level of exactly what's supposed to happen, who's supposed to do it, and so on. And I haven't, but I can on any one of these levels add additional instructions. That can be really useful from a planning and build standpoint. If I go to reports and I look at, let's look at both of them, you'll see that this is a nice, useful thing for somebody who's about to set out to build this thing because they can see exactly what those instructions are. So any instructions that were included at any one of these levels are all here, and that's really helpful for things like telling people what to pull, any particular special treatment that's required for a sub-assembly item or a component that's going into this. So lots of useful information on there. The trial build process is more about inventory availability. Can I build this? If I can't build this, what am I short? What parts are going into this particular thing? So the production order itself can be really, really useful. It becomes the working document, as I said at the beginning, for building this particular item. So let's close that. So now I'm ready to go. I know that I want to build the kayak deluxe. I want to build the upper assembly, the roller riser, the lift assembly, and the tie-down system universal, and I want to keep track of that process. There's lots of things that we can do here. I could assign a customer if this is for a particular customer. I don't have to. This can be for the purposes of building the stock. That works fine, just fine too. I can also assign phases. In this example, I didn't want to complicate it too much, so I haven't started using phases, but suffice it to say that especially for production, phases can be quite useful. Those might be things like there's a phase to pull your stock, there's a phase to assemble, there's a phase for finishing, there's a phase for quality sign-off, and those phases are automatically tracked as you progress through each one of those phases. So the date, the person who advanced the phase, and so on are all tracked automatically as part of this process. You don't have to do it. It's just very, very helpful if you do. One of the biggest parts of this, and again, one of the advantages given that it's integrated with Spire, is I can at this point say, okay, I'm ready to go. What does ready to go mean? It means I'm going to go start pulling the materials in order to work on this production order. So if I put that in progress, that happens automatically. But just before I do, let's look at weld rods. If I go to open inventory, we'll see that right now there's 20 weld rods available and there's 20 on hand, but nothing's committed. Let's go to in progress, and we'll do the same thing again. We'll go back to weld rods, we'll open inventory, and we'll see, oh, actually, need to save first. I haven't really actually done it yet. Let's open that weld rod again. So now we'll see what I expected to see, which is there's 20 on hand, but 8 are now committed, and the available quantity is 12. Meaning what you effectively said when you went from just an open production order, which is sort of a promise to do something, to in progress, is that you want to pull those materials and in fact have committed those materials. So they can't be sold, they can't be used on another production order. Anybody else who's trying to build things that share materials is going to be warned that they can no longer build that production order. So super useful that commitment can take place without really having to do anything more than just change the production order into in progress and save it. One little hint here for people who are using production order processing, this ability for you to go into in progress all at once is the default, but there's another way to do it. I'm going to show you that quickly. If I go into user settings and look at where are we? Production orders. Sorry, that's not what I wanted. There's this setting automatically in production orders called automatic commit, which, as I said, is turned on. So when I go into that in progress phase, it automatically commits the entire production order to the extent that it can as soon as you save that production order. One option is if you turn this off, what happens is that going to the in progress phase doesn't automatically commit the production order. And what will happen, I didn't turn it off, but what will happen if I do that is that instead of what happened here, where the committed quantities were automatically allocated the moment I put it in progress and saved, is that you can then on a line-by-line basis commit individual inventory items. So what's this useful for? It's useful when you want to start pulling things off shelves. So if this is a complex bill of material, it might be difficult for me to say, okay, I need this, I need this, I need this, I need this. It might be multiple days' work for me to even pull the materials down to a workstation for me to even be able to begin. So by turning that off on a user basis, the user can then come in and say, I'm going to commit the inventory line by line as I pull it out of stock, move it over to my bench and start that process. So again, another option. And there are quite a few options in production processing that can help things along as you're working. So now I've committed inventory. I'm ready to start on this production order. So how do I do that? How do I actually build this production order? Well, if I'm happy with how this is set up, meaning go and pull all the individual materials, I can go ahead at any point and say that I want to build this. So building this tells me what the roll-up cost is. We already knew what the roll-up cost is, $617.07, because it's the extended cost of that particular kayak rack. Bear in mind that in a materials environment, that number can change and likely will change as items are being received on purchase orders. The cost is going to be changing on an ongoing basis, and that, of course, is important for you to keep up with, making sure you're making your margins on selling prices. But if I want to build one, I just go ahead and choose build. That removes the production order and puts it into production history. So I now have a history of everything that I've done. And if I preview this, it shows me the production build. The part of your process might be to sign this report off to say, okay, I'm done. But this shows you everything you pulled and everything that you did and the full extended cost and why it cost that much to build at the date at which it was built or received. And of course, if I come back to my kayak rack, what I should see here when I look at the kayak rack is that the cost is $617.07, which we knew. I have one on hand and one available. And if I look at the parts that go into it, what I should see is that they have been brought down by the commensurate amount with something that was in there. There's my bolts. And what I should see is that I've actually used up some of the bolts that went into this particular thing. I started with 20. I've used up 10 of them. So that's basically the production process. If I go into production history, obviously there's complete fidelity of what happened. So I can come back into production history and see exactly what got built and what the purchase order was for that and who the customer was and all the information. But this is, of course, history, so you can't modify any of it. You can just sort of see exactly what happened. We didn't talk at all about communications or UDFs, but there's lots of opportunity for you to record additional information against these production builds, as is often required when you're dealing with complex builds. So there's the production process, sort of from the starting with the production order standpoint. There's lots of things that we didn't talk about. Let's go back into production. We didn't talk about pulling from templates. I'll give you a kind of a quick rundown on that. So effectively, when you start this process, you are pulling from a template. You are pulling from a bill of material. But those templates can both change here, and you want to push those back to the bill of material in inventory, which you can do with push to template, meaning I'm going to change this now going forward. Or you can even pull from template. And pull from template means this production order may have gone out of sync with the changes that you're making to the actual recipe or bill of material for this item. So the push and pull can become pretty instrumental when you're talking about producing things over the long term where there are changes that you want to either push to the bill of material or pull from the bill of material. Part number replacements, changes of parts based on a particular application. And then, of course, I haven't mentioned, but probably should mention, that this particular usage of these bills of materials can be unique to this particular build as well. There's nothing stopping that. Fully supports serialized inventory and lot number processing, that both at the parent level, and it can use up serial numbers and lots within the components themselves, and it records that all automatically. What else haven't I mentioned? It handles switching to alternatives. So if you've got alternatives set up in inventory, it can do an automatic switch out for you. If it runs out of a particular item, it can go down to the next item in the chain of alternatives. Okay, so that's how you basically build the various different stages of a produced item or a bill of material item. But let's look at how this can all really and very nicely integrate together. So rather than save this production order, let's discard it. So we currently have no production orders, but let's start this where these things often start, and we'll start it on the sales side. So let's come into sales, and let's do it the slower way. Let's say that Car Plus wants to order a few of these. Oh, they have a note. Wants to order a few of these for stock for them. So let's go ahead and say they're going to request 3 Kayak Rack Deluxes. So we know that we currently have 1 in stock. We built 1 for stock, and that's sitting there, so it can allocate that, but we're short 2. So this is where requisitions becomes super useful. Just like if I was trying to buy an item for a customer and I wanted to have the requisition to a purchase order for a vendor, I can requisition this, and that requisition, if I look at the order number up here, when I process, automatically creates a production order. So there's my second production order. If I save and close that, what I'll see, let's save and close that, is if I go into production, there's now my production order, and it's automatically filled in that it's 4 Car Plus, that we're requesting 2 because we had 1 in stock, and all the information that's there. You'll see in the production order, you've got the requisition number of the sales order, and if I come back into the sales order, let's go back into sales. The sales order has automatically recorded the production order number. So there's my production order and the target order number for that particular production order. So really nice and easy and simple. Right from the sales order, I've created a requisition. That requisition for a sub-assembled or an assembled item becomes a production order. But let's keep that going. We'll go to the production order. And we know for a fact, based on our prior builds, that we're short some things. So from the production order, we can go directly to a requisition. And the requisition from a production order is going to be creating purchase orders. So if I go ahead and process those, what we'll see is if there are vendors associated with those items that I'm buying, it will automatically create the requisite purchase orders in order to fulfill this. And let's go ahead and save and close that. And save and close that. And what we'll see is if I go to the production order, the purchase orders, that there are the new purchase orders that got created, And right within the purchase orders that got created, if I look across, I can see who the source customer number was for that particular purchase order, and that it was sourced from a production order. So you've got a full flow right across this process. And the nice part about this is if I go ahead and say, let's just skip directly to receive, and I'll just take the defaults there, that filters back up again such that if I use the receipts order fulfillment, anybody receiving the purchase orders automatically knows where that particular item is supposed to be going. So, okay, that particular item is supposed to be going into the finished product kayak rack deluxe for that particular purchase order. So it isn't just that the production order process is really useful and quite straightforward. It's also that it integrates all the way through the process. So all the way down from sales to production, from production to purchase order, from purchase order back to the production order, from the production order back to the sales order. It just makes this whole process of selling right through to building and purchasing a really nice, straightforward process. So I could finish that off, but that gets the idea that it's all nicely integrated together. One thing I usually like to do, just to kind of end things off, is show you enhancements we've made. One recent enhancement we made was we added to the API the production order, so you can create a production order through the API. So here I've got a production order, as we can see, and I was producing the kayak rack deluxe. But let's leave that up here, and I'm just going to go run a quick batch file. I'll explain this in a second. And if I've set that up correctly, when I come back here and refresh, what I'll see is that I've created one of the subcomponents. Remember, the roller riser is the subcomponent via the API. And that's really handy for people who are using production, is if you want to integrate your existing systems to just push your own version of, I want to build this, you can do that via the API. I can go into a lengthy explanation, but suffice it to say, I kind of promised I wouldn't get too technical here, but it's really just taking the endpoint of a particular production order and using that endpoint's JSON essentially to duplicate how you want to go about doing production orders. And that can be a single level, multiple levels, whatever. My experience has been that people who are using manufacturing software almost certainly are doing some of their own integrations, and that just expands your ability to do that. You could always integrate directly going to the database. This is just so much simpler. That production order and even more complex production orders is really simple to go about building just by sending the appropriate things to the right endpoints. So again, very quick overview of production order processing. Suffice it to say that it's very inexpensive relative to its contemporaries out there, and the biggest advantage, of course, is that it's fully integrated right through the entire Spire inventory control process, purchasing process, and sales process. Hopefully that gives you some additional information and some idea about the power of the production module. Thank you.